Okay, there has been a marked ethical turn in contemporary art which runs parallel to a general movement within political theory towards a reinvigorated ethical discourse over the last few decades. Ethics has become one of the key economies, if not the overriding criterion, through which contemporary art is judged. Since art's social turn, it is not the formal properties of art objects that count. The character of its social relations have turned into its form. Art, after ethics, has become ethical. While writing this paper, I received an email that began with the following sentence. Today, 4th of November 2015, the radical granddaddy of the art world, Gustav Metzger, is calling on arts professionals to make the shift from aesthetics to ethics to help address the many environmental crises that we face. While superficially this email confirmed my opening idea for the paper, it also appears to refute it, with the implication that the shift from aesthetics to ethics has not already happened. Let me refine my initial argument then. There is at present a tension between ethics and aesthetics, which includes something like a tendency or an incomplete step towards ethics as a substitute for aesthetics. Alongside the ethics of ecological responsibility, the ethics of representation, the ethics of participation, the ethics of institutional care, art and its institutions are now subject to the ethics of art washing and the ethics of internships, as well as the ethics of pedagogy and the ethics of the art boycott. According to Alistair McIntyre, modern ethics is emotivist, in which saying that something is good or virtuous is equivalent to saying, I like it, or I approve of this. Emotivist ethics has no grounding except in the subject. Modern ethics, therefore, seems little more than a matter of taste, of personal preference, and therefore belongs or borrows heavily from aesthetic discourse. Hence, if emotivism characterises the ethical turn in art, then the shift from aesthetics to ethics might be understood as a veiled aestheticism. Presumably this goes some way to explaining how ethics has bedded into art institutions so well. But it's not just emotivist ethics that expresses this affinity with aesthetics. Ethics, like aesthetics, requires judgment, for instance. Both are supposed to be produced subjectively and both produce subjects. Ethics and aesthetics refer us to the subject, to what used to be called character, or what today we might simply call responsibility. Simon Critchley appears to accept the aesthetic moment in ethics, as well as exceeding it, by characterising ethics as combining approval and demand, saying, quote, although the good only comes into view through approval, it is not good by virtue of approval, close quotation marks. He explains, ethical experience is first and foremost the approval of a demand that demands approval. Which is to say, in my terms, there is an aesthetic component of ethics, its subjective judgment-based form of approval, but ethics is fully ethical only if it, but ethics is fully ethical, is not fully ethical if it is reduced to or stalls at this aesthetic moment. Like in aesthetic judgment, it is individuals, not society, that are deemed to be answerable for ethical judgments. This is why ethical campaigns within the art world can be painful processes. Being told that your artwork or your museum falls on the wrong side of a new ethical boundary is uncomfortable, perhaps even traumatic. The ethics of art washing, for instance, is intended to traumatise. Artists, curators and others who have worked in institutions sponsored by big oil are meant to feel vulnerable, guilty or even remorseful. Its effect is dependent on the trauma that it produces. So if ethical and aesthetic judgments make us accountable as individuals, collective acts take on an ethical or aesthetic charge only when individuals are isolated from the groups to which they belong. While the norms embodied in ethics are social, the performance of ethical norms isolates individuals from that shared ground in the formation and maintenance of ethical subjects. As such, ethics makes a cut. Judith Butler's ethics of giving an account of oneself is based on a social encounter between an individual and the system of justice. Nietzsche did well, she says, to understand that I begin my story of myself only in the face of a you who asks me to give an account. Ethics here is a performative dialogical encounter which answers the question, are you responsible for this injury? Quote, we start to give an account only because we are interpolated as beings who are rendered accountable by a system of justice and punishment. I am interested in this dialectic of subject and system as it is played out in the ethics of contemporary art, but I'm also critical of the emphasis of her dialogical account. If the ethical turn of art can be reconceptualised through Butler's theory of an encounter with authority, then we need to identify the actants of the scene. Who plays the part of authority here? Funders, curators, the public, the state? It is perfectly feasible, of course, that authority is a virtual internalised one. It's important to note that this conscience has been radically reshaped or reoriented very recently through a process that is as social as it is individual. Artists started to be routinely asked to give an account of themselves ethically by curators and critics and funders only after those artists and curators who were engaged in institutional critique and the new institutionalism insisted on such questions for themselves and for each other. As such, it is not always easy to identify who represents authority in the ethical term. Would it be preferable then to think of a dispersed, mobile ontology of authority? Let's keep in mind a variety of relations between subjects and systems, including interiorization and resistance. An individual's performative encounter with authority retains an attachment to an orthodox ethics of the cut. Butler is alert to the incoherence and fictionalisation of the subject, both for the subject and for others, but her ethics remains, nevertheless, a matter of the subject, minimally social insofar as the subject is face-to-face with another, a single other, which is why she supplements her ethical theory with reflections on psychoanalysis. Ethics is subjective, of course, but since ethics involves the presence of social forces within the subject and places the subject in relation to others, we must think of ethics as social too. By contrast, manifestos and other collective acts of publishing do not give an account of oneself. They give an account of ourselves. Also, some ethical acts can be realised only through collective activity. For example, when a local community comes together to provide support in response to a major disaster. Also, many ethical situations are institutional or systemic, not individual. Nevertheless, Butler is right to theorise ethics as a performative mode of conduct. Ethics is one of the narratives through which we shape who we are, albeit fragilely, and shape who we appear to be, albeit fictionally. But ethics is not only operative when the actor is called by authority to speak. Ethics is already operative within acts themselves. Although it makes sense to think of an educational process by which children learn to be ethical through iterative encounters with authority that call them to account, the ethical reflection on activity makes no sense without the assumption that activity was already ethically charged. Intuitively, the speech act is a report on ethical activity already performed. More fundamentally, we give an account of ourselves primarily through what we do, not what we say. Contemporary artists and art institutions are ethical insofar as they present themselves and police themselves as normative agents in relation to others. Possibly as an extension of institutional critique, normative standards are being established that are not unlike the powerful transformative crusade for political correctness. Ethics in this manner is a vital form of re-education that challenges and blocks the kind of ethical behaviour, including its blindnesses, that education and experience has already deposited in encultured individuals. Art's ethical turn is a process of unlearning and re-education that transposes art and its institutions to an ethical regime to come, a new regime of care for the participant, the public, and the enduring values of social engagement. In order to address some of the issues that cluster around the constellation of individuals and institutions, I want to expand on what Simon Critchley calls the motivational deficit of modern ethics. Ethics, if it is operative, compels action. While ethics cannot force any specific act without sacrificing its ethical character, ethics is ethical only if it is a normative driver of conduct. Institutions have a role to play in the conversion of values into action, but it is not clear how ethics accomplishes its motivational purpose, and I don't want to turn to emotions such as anger, outrage and love, as important as they are, to solve this particular riddle. There is another motivational force that needs to be bracketed off here. It is commonly assumed, for instance, that religion acts as a motivator of acts that can be scrutinised ethically. It appears feasible because religious justifications are given for acts of holy terror, such as crusades and suicide bombings. However, religion, I would say, is the background to such behaviour and requires an ethical compulsion to drive it. So rather than seeing religion as the active element in holy terror, we need to see ethics as the activating force within religion. Here then, we can see another way in which ethics differs from aesthetics. Whereas aesthetics and ethics share a basis in subjectivity, and each triggers the judgment of judgments, aesthetics does not demand action. Another difference. It is easier to live with rival judgments of taste than rival ethical principles. Although McIntyre is right to emphasise that contemporary morality is characterised by interminable disagreements and a multiplicity of rationally justified but opposing and incommensurable ethical positions, McIntyre comes closest to beginning his treatise on ethics in the way that Hume began his treatise on aesthetics. Quote from Hume, "The great variety of taste which prevails in the world is too obvious not to have fallen under everyone's observation. The difficulty for ethics, however, is to reconcile general and abstract ethical principles with individual and particular acts, whereas the difficulty for aesthetics, inversely, is to reconcile multiple and particular judgments with a general standard of taste. In both cases, it is particularity that poses the problem, but aesthetics appears to be mired in particularity, whereas ethics appears to fall perpetually short of it. This is why ethics needs motivation, whereas aesthetics needs to shed interest. Nevertheless, ethics and aesthetics cannot be cordoned off from one another. Schiller represents the strongest version of their interdependence. There is an ethical urgency to aesthetics for Schiller, since he believes that human beings, quote, must learn to desire nobly. Here, aesthetics is conceived of as an activity that is indispensable for the ethical subject. The shared goal of ethics and aesthetics for Schiller is freedom, and he makes it difficult to think of freedom of the individual and of humanity as a whole without the two being bound together. An historical link between taste and ethics can be detected in what has come to be known as ethical consumerism. Iris Marion Young theorises this ethic by analysing the student anti-sweatshop movement in the 1990s, which, quote, raised questions about the conditions under which the garments worn by their sports teams and sold in their bookstores are made. Young's description of the sense of responsibility expressed in ethical consumerism remains vivid today. Quote, activists in the anti-sweatshop movement claim that we relatively affluent people in the global north share responsibility for the fate of the faraway workers because structural processes connect us to them, end quote. Ethical consumerism, I want to argue, is a form of responsibility rooted in the bourgeois world, not only because it is realised through consumption, but also because it borrows its structure of responsibility from the bourgeois conception of taste as it was expressed in displays of consumer goods in the 17th and 18th centuries. What Neil McKendrick calls the consumer revolution codified the homes and bodies of the bourgeoisie as bearers of taste. Middle-class households were judged on their purchases. Taste became a marker of character, and it quickly became impossible to buy something without considering how the next purchase would reflect on one's taste or lack of it. Since the 1990s, the judgment of consumer choices has transposed from an economy of taste to an economy of ethics. Consumption has become an ethical technique for making judgments on the ethical principles of companies. Of course, once commodities are judged in terms of their ethical charge, then consumers are judged in terms of their ethically charged consumer choices. Like the bourgeoisie of the 17th and 18th century, contemporary consumers cannot purchase use values without at the same time displaying something about themselves. Like taste, which appeared both as embodied in the commodity and belonging to the soul of the consumer, the ethics of retail responsibility is a stain that goes all the way down through every layer, from the character of the consumer through the commodity, and spreads into all that comes into contact with it. Ethics, or its transgression, is a disease. Unethical businesses sow seeds of immorality that take root in the personality of the cursed consumer. Ethical consumerism is the exemplar, I would say, of art's current ethical turn. This can be seen in the hardened sense of ethical correctness that prevails in contemporary campaigns against unethical corporate sponsorship of the arts, the widespread use of unpaid internships in arts public institutions, the imperative to reduce art's carbon footprint, the alleged exploitation of artists' assistants, the disproportionate success of white male artists against their female and black peers, and the recent obligation to pay artist assistants and so on. While the ethical turn in art might promote many good practices, without an inquiry into what makes ethics ethical, art's ethical turn consists of moralising without moral theory. Let me now turn then to the question of the ethic of ethics, which will lead me to consider the relationship between ethics and politics. I want to use Marx and Alain Badiou as a wedge to keep open the door for a critical reconceptualisation of ethics. Stephen Luke's argued that Marxism has a paradoxical stance on ethics. Kate Silper spells out Luke's argument, quote, "On the one hand, it presents morality as nothing more than bourgeois prejudice, a form of ideology that is social in origin, illusory in content, and serving class interests. On the other hand, Marxism continually implies and often explicitly invokes moral concepts and categories in its critique of capitalism and advocacy of communism." For Luke's, this is a paradoxical stance. I want to finesse this argument a little. Marx's critique of ethics is embodied in his rejection of the campaign for fair wages or just pay. His argument did not turn on an ethical argument about the injustice of low wages, but on the comparison of this ethical campaign for higher wages to propositions for instance, a more just form of slavery rather than abolishing the slave economy altogether. Marx's argument is not an ethical argument, but it is nonetheless ethically charged in its analysis of the concrete historical situation. Alain Badiou's critique of ethics replicates the dialectical ethics that Luke identifies as paradoxical. He is scathing about ethics in general, and yet develops his own ethics of fidelity to the event and the imperative to keep going. Ethics, he argues, requires a victim to save, and he rejects the ethical construction of victimhood in an argument that is itself ethical. It amounts essentially to an ethical rejection of ethics. Read slightly differently, what a Marxist critique of ethics suggests, I want to say, is that we need to distinguish between the ethical subject formed by culturalisation and the ethical subject reformed by a critique of that moral order. Ethics needs to be distinguished between the ethical content of socialisation that is necessary for the reproduction of society, the system, and the ethical content of the unlearning and re-education necessary for social change, an ethical subject committed to changing the system. As we witnessed in the case of art's ethical turn, new ethical principles confront established ones when existing ethical values are felt to be ethically unacceptable. The confrontation of rival ethics, I want to say, is the politicisation of ethics. The first condition of a critical ethics, therefore, is to recognise that ethics, which compels human action according to abstract principles derived from the existing social order, can as easily compel acts that reinstate, proliferate and amplify exploitation and abuse as promote care and justice. Let me explain. Those within a given social order and a given ethical order typically regard ethics as a positive force. It feels as though its presence activates individuals to conduct themselves better, and its absence fails to curtail the worst kinds of human neglect, abuse and exploitation. However, the ethics of historical or cultural others often appear to us to be loaded with the values of social division and hierarchy. For instance, the ethical treatment of women within patriarchal societies often signify women's alleged weakness and delicacy. Everything from opening the door for a lady and not swearing in female company, to giving up one's own seat for a woman, and the custom of men paying for dinner and drinks. None of these kindnesses are intrinsically bad, but the ethics of patriarchy codifies these good deeds according to a strict gender division, and every ethical act of patriarchal chivalry, therefore, iterates the normative value of the gendered division of society. Rather than thinking that these acts were never genuinely ethical, it is more telling, I think, to regard these loaded acts of chivalry as exemplary of ethics. No social system and its constitutive inequalities can be activated and reproduced without its signature forms of ethical motivation. Ethics is the motivating force of all kinds of bias, prejudice, retribution, violent confrontation, pious hatred, and terrorism. Considered as a social force that acts on individuals by charging subjective decisions with normative content, ethics is the only social mechanism available to compel someone to stone someone else to death, to burn down the house of an alleged paedophile, or shun our neighbour for having an affair. Ethics is the only force that can compel us to do harm to others in order to remake ourselves or confirm ourselves as good. Ethics, therefore, casts a disturbing shadow. This is why nihilism cannot be entirely dismissed, and why the Marxist critique of ethics cannot be simply dispensed with in order to return ethics to its ancient certainties. Ethical philosophy has neglected the difficulty that arises from the ethical motivation of horrific acts. Ethics is connected to the good without considering how the performance of the good might take all kinds of neglectful and cruel forms. Intuitively, might hope to turn to ethics to discriminate between the good and the cruel. But I would suggest that this is beyond ethics. It is doubtful, I would say, that ethics has the tools to discriminate ethically charged monstrosity from ethics. A meta-ethics is possible, namely to inquire into what is ethical about ethics, but I don't believe that any meta-norms can be established over and above specific ethical codes, although perhaps each ethical code takes itself to be precisely such a universal normative framework. Ethics cannot decide between rival ethics. Since ethics expresses the existing political settlement abstractly in terms of its highest aims, ethics can achieve its purpose only by turning into politics. That is, by aligning itself to the processes of transforming the existing political settlement. It is often assumed that politics needs a moral compass in order to prevent abuses of human rights in the headlong campaign to bring about radical social change. This is in fact one of the common complaints against Marxism, quote, that Marxism is deficient, if not downright unscrupulous, in its approach to morality. But if ethics cannot shed its own shadow, that is to say, if there are no meta-norms, then disagreement must be resolved through the same processes as all disagreements. In the absence of meta-norms, there is only politics. Hell is other people who insist on ethical principles that contradict your own. A variety of hell, therefore, is having your art administered or reviewed by someone who insists on an ethical regimen that you regard as reproducing the social values that you're trying to overcome. Ethics is a regime of care for encountering others, of course, but if ethics is a demand that demands approval, then ethics is an illiberal discourse for judging the conduct of rival ethical subjects.